teachers typically were back in those days. We were put in front of the speaking classes, get them talking. I was grappling with what the hell is the mechanism which explains what learning might occur when learners are trying to do something communicative. And there was no answer to that. It was like, it's a black box. Do the learners in your classroom have choice?
Oh, I love that.
Because choice is related to agency. Choice generates agency, generates engagement. Engagement, of course, is associated with motivation, and motivation is associated with learning. So simple as that. So often when I've observed classes, there's so little choice because they're just going through the formula, PPP. I have quite a few teachers coming through our master's program, and they talk to me about how they have to unlearn some of their CELTA training. They have to let go of this security blanket of, there's a nice pattern. Here's what we're focusing on today. This is the grammatical structure, and this is what we're going to do to work on it. The teachers need to be prepared to take risks, make mistakes. And in doing so, it's falling forwards. As a teacher, if you're not falling over, you're not probably pushing yourself. If you give learners tasks, they have to invest. And when they invest, they take ownership. And ownership is what we have to be aiming for here, where the learners feel like they own this language. It's part of them. It's not something out there which is imposed on them.
This is the Teacher Talking Time podcast.
What actually happens when learners are asked to communicate? For a very long time, I feel that question has sat at the center of language teaching, and for many teachers, it still feels like a black box. And in this episode of the podcast, we sit down with Professor Jonathan Newton, who is an associate professor at Victoria University of Wellington, where he also leads postgraduate programs in TESOL and Applied Linguistics. To those of you who don't know, Jonathan has spent more than 30 years working across classrooms in China, New Zealand, and beyond, and he was trying to do one thing: understand how language learning actually happens. He has published widely with over 80 articles and several key books on task-based teaching, speaking, and classroom interaction. But what really drives his work is a much deeper question. Not just are learners communicating, but what are they learning when they do? From his very early career, from his early teaching, he began to notice that learning wasn't coming from what was being presented. It was actually happening inside interaction. And it is in these moments of struggle, in these moments of negotiation, in these moments when learners are trying to say something they don't yet fully know how to say. And that was the insight that changed everything. Because learning, as we know, doesn't come from what we teach. It comes from what learners do with language. And maybe, most importantly, from having choice. Because as Jonathan says, choice creates agency. Agency drives engagement, and engagement is where learning begins. So this episode is not just about task-based language teaching, folks. It's about what happens when we stop controlling every step and start creating conditions where learners take ownership of language.
This episode is brought to you by our friends at Fluentize. Fluentize is a library of over 650 ready-to-teach ESL lessons built around my favorite part, authentic videos for your adult and teenage students. Learn more on their website, fluentize.com. That link is in the show notes. And if you could do Leo and I a huge favor and hit that subscribe button wherever you're listening to this show, it would really help us out.
I have so many questions that I wanted to ask you, Jonathan, but I think I'm going to start with, I would say, a very simple one, because I feel like a lot of people might not know you. So the question I have for you, Jonathan, is who are you? And if you had to summarize your career, what have you spent it trying to understand or change? Specifically, also when you make strong claims about language learning, what are the main references point behind it, the data, the classrooms, the mentors, and the moments that shaped your wisdom?
Leo, there's an awful lot there. Let me start with the first part, and you might need to repeat the second question. So the first part is, who am I? And let's deal with that to start with. So I guess people may not know me because I'm tucked away down in the South Pacific in New Zealand, although that's no excuse because, of course, Rod Ellis spent many years here and Paul Nation is here. But we do tend to be flying under the radar down here in New Zealand. So I've been in language teacher education for about 30 years, which is pretty scary. I began my career as a language teacher in China back in the 80s. Having finished my first degree in history and sociology and not quite knowing what to do with my life, I ended up teaching language and then coming back to university doing linguistics and through to my PhD and so forth. So I've been working here at Victoria University of Wellington since I graduated from my PhD in the 90s. So that's me, and primarily working with teachers, so a bit of context, from the Asia-Pacific region and primarily from Asia. So that's our catchment, if you like. So we're very linked into sort of China and Vietnam and Thailand and Malaysia and so forth. So that's me in a nutshell. Now, the second part was, Leo, just repeat that for me.
Like, what have you spent the last 30 years of your life trying to understand or trying to change?
Wow, okay. Trying to understand. Let me go back to China. So I was, as a native speaker, teachers typically were back in those days, we were put in front of the speaking classes. In my case, it was the speaking classes and the writing classes. Get them talking. This was at a university in Xi'an. And this was back in the days of, I suppose, Krashen's influence and CLT. Basically, give them activities, group work, and get them to talk. Language learning, well, don't interfere in the natural process. And I did that as much as I could and tried to make the classes fun, but it felt like I was grappling with what the hell is the mechanism which explains what learning might occur when learners are trying to do something communicative. And there was no answer to that. It was like it's a black box. And so I puzzled through that, and I would sit in the library at the university reading stuff. God, back then, what was it? Krashen and Penny and this sort of stuff. And I didn't quite get to an answer, but I came back to New Zealand to do my teacher training and then went into my master's and PhD. And my PhD was focused on what happens, what are the acquisition processes that we can identify in group work, right? Task-based group work. And this was around the time that Mike Long was promoting negotiation for meaning. And his argument was the points where there's a communication breakdown and learners are trying to resolve that breakdown, they're really at the cutting edge of their current knowledge and where they need to expand their knowledge. So if you can get those little negotiation sequences going, each time one of those happens, there's incremental change, restructuring, improvement of the learner's language facility. Yeah. So my PhD was around that, and I was looking at, and particularly with Paul Nation as my supervisor, one dimension of that was looking at, and it was, I think, probably the first. I didn't publish it for quite a while afterwards, unfortunately. I was just really busy with work and not particularly oriented towards publishing. But I was looking at, can we measure incidental acquisition of vocabulary through learners encountering unfamiliar words while they're doing a task, without any kind of pre-teaching, just here's a new word. What do they do with it? How do they navigate that problem? And then using pre and post tests, can we find evidence of learning? Because up until that point, and stop me if I'm going on too far on this.
I was going to ask you, like, what happened? What did you find after that? I'm actually interested in that.
Yeah, I'll just get to that in a minute. But up until that point, there was a whole lot of research on negotiation for meaning in group work and tasks. And it was all about counting how many negotiations happen in an information exchange task compared to a discussion task. So it was a counting negotiations. Without a lot of evidence for, is there evidence that they make a difference, that they lead to acquisition? So in my research, we found pretty clearly that where words were negotiated, there was a much higher incidence of recall of those words subsequently. But it wasn't only through negotiation, because the learners who weren't negotiating but were part of the group would also acquire some knowledge of the words, some ability to recall the words, but also just seeing other learners use words that learners weren't familiar with, but they just were part of this process. And without even explicitly saying, hang on, I don't understand that word, they were able to show greater recall simply through being involved in that process. I look back now and I think it's not a big deal, but at that point, there was no evidence to show learning from group work of that kind, tangible acquisition.
It's interesting you say that, because I feel like we're still somewhat stuck in the whole pre-teaching of vocabulary in task-based language teaching lessons, where we really expect that which is taught is what is going to be learned. And to quote what Mike Long said a couple of, I'd say, years ago, what is taught is not necessarily what is learned when you want them to learn. Sure. And I think your work kind of touches on that. And what you just said makes a lot of sense, specifically with the idea of negotiation for meaning. And I want to jump into that because a lot of teachers, Jonathan, when they hear the word task-based language teaching, I find that they feel two things at once: a lot of interest, but also a lot of pressure. Mm-hmm. And before we go anywhere else, in your experience, when you hear teachers talking about TBLT today, what do you think they are actually hoping it will fix? But at the same time, what are they quietly worried it might break?
Yeah, good questions. What can it fix? I think most teachers, so I teach in a master's program here, and I have a lot of students. I teach a course on TBLT to teachers from around Asia. Most of them come at TBLT thinking that it's communicative language teaching, thinking that it's putting learners in groups and getting them to talk. So that's just, and it's much more than that. It's much broader than that. So rather than the teachers coming wanting to use TBLT to fix something, they come to thinking that's not going to work. I don't believe it can work in my context. So my job is to bring them partway towards it and say, let's just think about what it is you're worried about, and let's try and work on those challenges and obstacles that you see are in the way. So that partly answers your question.
What about their concern? What are they worried it might break? Because I feel like a lot of the teachers that we, in our context here in North America, a lot of them think that because you're not actively teaching, there will be no learning.
Yeah.
But based on your experience, what do you think they are quietly worrying it might break?
Yeah. They're concerned that if they do a task, it's going to take too long, and that is always the case. In reality, when you taskify lessons, they take longer. You're doing things which are interactive. It's much faster just to stand at the front and teach. So at this time, a lot of the teachers I work with work in very constrained contexts, very top-down contexts, where they have to get through these textbook lessons in these weeks, and you don't skip, you don't jump, you don't go ahead, you stay on track, regardless.
Horse track English.
Yeah. There's some real problems there and challenges they feel. They also, of course, are concerned about lack of control. They're also concerned, and this is an interesting one, Leo. Consistently, teachers say, my learners can't do tasks because they don't know enough language.
Yeah.
Or they never talk in the class. They're too shy.
That's and this the elephant in the room here for us. But
And it's extraordinary because every time, without question, every time they try a task, they come back and they say, they can do more than I realized. So if you've had, I'm not trying to teacher bash here at all, but if teachers come from a tradition which is teacher-centric, and so they're typically used to presenting the language that the students then put into very controlled practice, the students have no familiarity with stepping out of those boundaries, and they're not given an opportunity to, so the teachers never see it.
Yes.
And that the teachers aren't used to letting go of the reins. And consistently, teachers are surprised, as long as the task is well designed, that, these learners really step up.
Yes.
What is it? Letting go of the reins is an interesting phrase. What does that mean to you in the classroom setting?
It means giving learners opportunities to do things with language and to construct the language they need to do those things at the same time, which teachers think, hang on, they can't do it if they don't have the language. But the learners find their ways around things. Yeah. And certainly I've worked in heterogeneous contexts in the latter part of my career where you've got learners from different countries. So it's a bit easier there because they bring different pools of language knowledge into group work. In homogenous classrooms, there's predictable what learners will and won't know. But nevertheless, when you put learners in groups, they are remarkably good at helping each other. I'll give you an example from my research with me in Vietnam. So she was looking at teaching speaking lessons in high school classrooms in Vietnam. And what the teachers would do, they would typically just avoid in this case, actually, in violation to what I said before, they would actually just bypass the speaking lessons in the textbook. Because in a sense, speaking wasn't examined, so it didn't matter so much there. And they would give learners a task, and they would put learners in pairs or small groups, and they would give them 10 minutes to prepare. or if you like, rehearse.
Mm-hmm.
And then different groups would be asked to volunteer to perform the task. Now, the learners are working on the task in groups. So it might be talk about your future career, or talk about what you're going to do in the summer holidays, what you want to do, and where you're going to do it, and so forth. And you look, and we recorded all these wonderful dyadic interactions of these learners, mostly in pairs. They were moving between English and Vietnamese, and they were using Vietnamese a lot to ask questions to each other. How do I say this phrase in English? And then they would work out together. They'd put that phrase in, then they'd practice it, they'd move on. And then and we've published a couple of articles on this, and then you would see the performance they would, and by the way, in this context, you think, oh, learners don't want to perform. The teacher asks, okay, who would like to stand up? And they're all putting up their hands saying, choose us, choose us.
Very interesting.
Right, because they've invested.
Yes.
They've been given agency to work on this together. And of course, the teacher is circulating too and helping out where it's needed. And then they stand up. And the extraordinary data we've got is that if you look at the rehearsal and then the performance, the rehearsal, half Vietnamese, half English, figuring out what words to use, what can we say here, what can we say there. The performance, all in English, fluent, using these new phrases that they've come up within the group work. So you've got right there again, you've got evidence, at least in the short term, of acquisition, I would say, in a sense that learners are struggling with these terms and phrases, and here they are putting them into use.
I love that, what you just said there, Jonathan, because it sounds like basically this idea of using their own resources they don't just use what you taught them 5 minutes ago. They're pulling in from everything they know, old language, new language, half-remembered phrases, workarounds.
Yep.
Right? And
first language.
Yeah,
first
language. So they're basically...
Put up your hand and ask the teacher, check the dictionary.
Exactly.
This is all getting the resources. But the key thing here is agency. The learners they have some agency. They can choose where they're going with this. And I think the word choice, if I had to choose one word to give to teachers around TBLT, there's all sorts of other words, I would say choice is the word. Do the learners in your classroom have choice?
Oh, I love that.
Because choice is related to agency. And so often when I've observed classes, there's so little choice because they're just going through the formula, PPP. We're going to practice this conversation, practice the dialogue in pairs. Now substitute with your own game or your own choice, but it's just so trivial.
It's trivial, it's boring, it's safe, it's controlled. And we know that this is not how real communication works. I think what you said, it's basically what happens in most language classrooms. Like the teacher pre-teaches 5 new words or pre-teaches a very specific grammatical point, drills the target grammar, students complete a task using exactly that structure, those 5 words. As you said, it's safe, it's controlled, but they have absolutely no agency, they have absolutely no choice. It's not how real communication works. And what's missing is this sense that they stretch what they can already do. They work around those gaps, as you said, instead of freezing. They notice what they can say yet. And I think that's exactly where language acquisition, where development actually starts. Not in that repetition, that drill, but in that productive struggle. And it's interesting you said the word choice, because I want to talk about textbooks. That's where things usually get tense and there are not a lot of choices in that. There's a very strong narrative in parts of the TBLT world that textbooks are the problem. And I'm not going to mention names here, but Jeff Jordan, if you are listening to this, you know exactly that I'm talking about you. But most teachers...
I was going to mention that name if you didn't. But
oh yeah, you did. Sure. Good.
And Mike Long. Yeah.
And Mike
Hello,
Long
Jeff.
too, Jeff Jordan. And Jeff came on the podcast and he talked extensively about textbooks. But most teachers listening to this podcast, they don't have the option to drop them. Which brings me to the question, Jonathan, where do you think that hostility towards textbooks come from?
Oh, because there are so many terrible textbooks and they are so constraining. It's not surprising. And they're also probably envy because the textbook writers make a huge amount of money. There's a few millionaires, I won't name them, but I know.
You know who they are.
Multi-millionaires, I suppose. Everybody's a millionaire these days. But yeah. And also philosophically or theoretically, the fact that textbooks have just have been so resistant to adopting findings from SLA, people like Mike Long, they're resistant to textbooks. I think it was philosophical as well as theoretical. But you're simply not seeing evidence from SLA coming through in the way that textbooks with their fairly fixed PPP type lesson structures are designed. Can I just give you another example from?
Please.
I've got about 5 PhD students. I've had a few that are wonderful PhD students who've graduated over the years, but I've got 5 at the moment. Also, currently looking at textbook use in rural schools in different parts of Asia, in remote schools, looking at what are teachers doing in the places where resources are slim, where we're least likely to find the influence of TBLT, and what is the potential in these hard to change contexts, if you like, for TBLT to have an impact. One of my PhD students, and I've talked about this, if anybody's heard me before, they will have heard this particular example before, but it's a lovely one. Jing Yishuan, who graduated 2 years ago and in fact published her PhD, if I can just find it, just a bit of a plug for her wonderful book.
Oh,
it's back to front. Is it school-based?
The title, Jonathan? For
School-based
the
EFL teacher. School-based EFL teacher professional development for task-based language teaching, an ethnographically informed case study of rural China. So let me just give you a sort of a little vignette from that book. So she went into the school and she worked with the teachers over a semester. Just got to know the teachers, observed the classes, talked with them, talked to the parents, talked to the kids, and started working alongside the teachers. Now, I'll give you an example of a reading lesson. The teachers, and I worked in China, and this is pretty much how it was taught then. A reading lesson would be, here's the passage from the textbook. The teacher would read it sentence by sentence, translate it, talk about difficult words. So it wouldn't be reading as such. It's really grammar translation. Then there's 10 comprehension questions. Answer the questions in end of lesson. I'm simplifying, but that's pretty much how reading is taught. Now, the teacher in this case, in this vignette, was saying to Jing, the students hate reading. I don't like teaching. I don't feel like I'm very good at it. What can we do differently? So let me give you an example of what they did differently. And this was in a rural school where these kids were used to being taught to in this very kind of top-down teacher-centric method. So what they did, we had this lesson coming up where there were 2 diary entries. 2 kids were writing about their experience of going to a museum, 2 separate accounts of going to a museum. And they had to read them and answer questions about them. Typical reading lesson. So what they did with Jing, this is Jing's innovation, they said to the kids, okay, you can read this passage and you've got to come up with you work in groups, come up with some questions about the passages that you are then going to ask the teacher to test her knowledge, test her recall of the facts in the story. Now, if you saw the earlier lessons for these kids, they were just parroting when they were told to say something. And you might think, how can they go from parroting to creating their own questions?
Yeah.
It was a huge success. They were engaged. They were busy working on their questions because there was also the group that asks the most questions or whatever is the star group for the day. And of course, the teacher circulates around and helps them formulate the questions. But this allowed the students to have choice. They could choose what they asked about and agency. What was interesting in their questions? One is their questions were fantastic, but half the questions they asked were not really about the information in the passage. So there was something, for example, one of the kids saw a robot in the museum. Well, one of the questions was, can robots fight? They were and another question was, because one of the passages said that the museum is dark. Why is a museum dark? These are rural kids who've never been to a museum. Why is a museum dark? So there were kind of reference questions as well as display questions, if you want to turn this around. And it was the students asking the questions and the teacher answering them. According to Jing, when the class bell rang for the end of the lesson, they didn't want to leave because all the groups hadn't had a chance to answer their questions. Yeah. There's an example. Now, if you just think that through, there's an example in a rural school up in Gansu province in China, the poorest province in China, where drawing on task-based principles, a lesson was redesigned and was hugely successful.
Yeah.
Learners it's as if sometimes the more the teacher imposes their agenda, the lower the performance level of the students. But if the teacher can raise if you like, the zone of ZPD, not quite ZPD, the zone in which the learners can flex, then you just see this growth coming through.
I got a quick question for teachers watching this. How much time did you spend planning your lessons this week? If you said more than 10 minutes, then you gotta see this. This is Fluentize, a library of more than 650 lessons for teenagers and adult learners. Let's say I want a lesson on social issues. I jump into the lesson navigation, find the video, and boom, I have a complete lesson with authentic video ready to go. And the best part is that it covers everything: vocabulary focus, listening activities, deep communicative activities that also get your students actually talking. But here's what I love most. It comes with a Google Slide e-lesson ready to share with your class. So what are you waiting for? Head over to fluentize.com, create an account, and see the quality for yourself. I don't know if you're familiar with the work of Sarah Mercer, who talks a lot about engagement.
Yeah.
And Sarah, I remember she came on the show, and Andrew will probably remember this, but she talked a lot about fake engagement and real engagement. And what I see with a lot of PPP-oriented lessons is that there is this fake engagement, this sort of compliance where the students just do what the teacher, what the prof has asked them to do, versus task-based language teaching, where what you're basically describing is there is this genuine desire to contribute, they feel engaged. And as you said, they have a choice in the matter. They feel more invested. And I think that's the beauty of this.
I would just add to that. I think choice generates agency, generates engagement. Engagement, of course, is associated with motivation, and motivation is associated with learning. So simple as that.
So choice leads to agency, agency leads to engagement, engagement leads to motivation, and motivation is one of the essentials for learning anything. Oh, I like that. Yeah, sorry, Andrew, go ahead. You were saying.
No, that's okay. Only because the three of us here chatting is the converted talking to the converted. So it's a nice chat. Just for fun and just to be devil's advocate. Is there an argument? I've heard arguments about this. I think we interviewed Jason Anderson on the show years ago, and I hope he may have changed his mind since then. I don't know. I hope I'm representing it properly, but I think he was, and other people too have made this argument that PPP allows for teachers of lower proficiency and in more rural areas, like you've described, an easier strategy, I guess is the best word, to conduct the classes where they need to do it, and maybe their English level isn't what you would want it to be. What strategies can someone like that use to use a task-based approach even in that kind of setting?
So coming back to Jing's vignette, one of the things that Jing found with the teachers in rural schools is that they weren't getting an opportunity to use English apart from what they did in the classroom. And they want to develop their English. Now, using PPP, they're not getting those opportunities because they're just the mouthpiece for the textbook dialogue. So you can imagine this was great for the teacher as well, because in this context, the teacher had to answer the students' questions. The teacher had to, if you like, shift to a conversational mode of teaching, which is quite a big shift. It's no longer the teacher as the source of all authority, but the teacher as a conversational partner in the language. So that's one answer to your question. I think using tasks. Now, that's a tricky one because there's a lot of context where if the teacher shows any crack in the artifice of their authority and expertise, they're in trouble. I know everything. I'm the expert. That has to shift if you're going to... Where the teacher can make mistakes, the teacher can be a conversational partner.
I think Andrew's going to remember, we had Bill Van Patten on the show, and one of the things, he described that as the Atlas complex, that teachers want to carry all the weight of learning on their shoulders, and they think they are fully responsible for everything that happens in the classroom, even though we know that what happens here is not something that we can really control. So I think that's a very good way of illustrating this.
Trang Bui, now Associate Professor Trang Bui at Jian University in the Mekong Delta, who did a PhD with me looking at PPP. So she was looking in primary school classrooms down in that part of Vietnam, and the textbook, the speaking lessons are very PPP. So you've got this kind of dialogue with the cartoon pictures, which they read together, and then they do a kind of substitution table type thing, and then a simple task, if they ever get to it. Sometimes they avoid it. And you talk to the teachers. There was a range of views. Some of the teachers said, look, we need this kind of systematicity here. But an insightful comment that came through with a lot of the teachers was actually, the students are really bored. I'm finding the lesson really I'm bored. This is I need to do something different here. In fact, one of the teachers already was moving the task up to the front of the lesson and doing that first and then seeing what else flowed from that. So she then, in her PhD, redesigned the PPP lessons so that the first activity was an input-based task. So instead of just listening to listening to a recording of a dialogue and following along with their finger, they actually had to listen and they had to fill in a table, so an information gap listening. And the teachers said, and this again we've published on this, the teacher said, "Wow, suddenly the learners were really curious. Instead of falling asleep on their books, they were listening and they had their ears and they wanted to hear it again because there was why? Because there's choice to some extent, but there's a gap. This is, of course, the key thing with the task. They're filling a gap, and as soon as you've got some kind of information gap or a reasoning gap or an opinion gap, the very act of filling that gap provides an outcome or an objective beyond learning for the sake of learning. Yes, you're still learning, but you're doing it for a reason, and it's that reason which I think generates engagement.
Yeah.
Now, in this case, she found that the learners were really engaged in that input-based task. And then quite radically in this context, the next thing that the students did was an information gap activity in pairs. So they had to now do something similar. So, for example, with a school timetable, A has got some of the subjects and what times and who teaches them, and B's got another version of the timetable, and they have to exchange information. And again, she recorded dyads doing this activity in a context where this was typically not done, that it was very controlled and PPP. And again, the capacity for these young learners, these are grade 5, so these are, 8, 9-year-olds, to transact the activity, to solve it, to get through to the end, even if they had to use Vietnamese to help each other. And there's some lovely examples of one learner saying in Vietnamese to the other one, "Now you ask me, what day is math?" So what day is math? And who's the teacher in Vietnamese? So then saying to their partner in Vietnamese, "And who is the teacher?" "Oh, who is teacher?" So these are learners just scaffolding each other's navigation of the task and getting through. And the sense of achievement.
Yeah.
And there's one lovely example, I think I've published this, where at the end of the activity, one of the pairs that's being recorded has finished, but the teacher is on the other side of the room talking to somebody else. And one of the learners says, "Teacher, we've finished." Teacher doesn't hear them. And this learner turns to the partner and says, "What's your favorite subject?" In English. And the partner says, "Oh, I like math. What about you?" So you can see this is agency because they've invested, and investment is another word. You can see if you give learners tasks, they have to invest. And when they invest, they take ownership. And ownership is what we have to be aiming for here, where the learners feel like they own this language. It's part of them. It's not something out there which is imposed on them.
Yeah.
And textbooks too often impose on the learners. So how do you use the textbook in a way which gives learners ownership? Which comes back to agency, which comes back to choice, which comes back to tasks. Am I talking too much?
No, this is
why we're here.
fascinating. I feel like we are the listeners here, and everyone else who is listening is also probably really enjoying this. And I think...
Can I ask one more quick one, Leo, just on that
go ahead.
topic? Because the other end of that spectrum, just to put a bow on it, is the word textbook, and Mike Long is the other end of the spectrum. And there's a legend of a story, assuming it to be true. It goes somewhere along the line that Mike Long was asked if there's a TBLT textbook that exists, and his answer supposedly was, if there is one, then it's not a TBLT.
I reject that because that's based on Mike Long's notion that true TBLT is always needs-based, needs analysis-based. And so it's always derived from a particular context and a particular group of learners. And that's one version of TBLT. It's not a version I subscribe to. I think it's got a legitimate place in ESP, English for Specific Purposes, context, and perhaps to some extent in EAP, but in the general English context in which the vast majority of teachers I work with come from, doesn't make any sense. Rod Ellis has talked about a wants, or is it a wants analysis, not a needs analysis, but a wants analysis, and it's a topics analysis, or what are they interested in?
What's a wants analysis? I guess is a needs
what
analysis.
do you want to do in it?
A wants analysis. I thought you only do it once.
What do you want? Yeah. So
okay.
Let's come back to textbooks then. And I feel like with Jeff, from what I've read of his, and I like his work a lot, but he tends to pick on headway in a couple of these generic global textbooks. But you dig into the textbooks being produced now in national contexts.
I was going to ask that, yeah.
Yeah. In China, in Vietnam in particular, to some extent in Malaysia, they have a lot of activities that look very task-like. So it's shifting. Now, and in fact, the movement across in the Chinese context, certainly with the primary school textbooks, is to move right away from language description. It's actually getting learners to do things with language early on and as a primary focus in the lessons. And the same with the textbooks right through the school system in Vietnam. The focus now is on communicative skills. So if you open up the textbook, used in any schools in Vietnam, the first lesson is a conversation that they listen to and read. There's nothing that comes before it. It'll be a theme. It'll be the theme of family life. And then afterwards, they'll do some discussion activities. And then they'll move on to a listening lesson. Next lesson, there'll be 7 lessons in a unit. And then the third lesson might be, okay, we're now going to focus on some grammar in a lesson. And then the next lessons are all skills-based. So it's shifting. And when you move to a skills-based approach, you're halfway towards TBLT. Only halfway. If you've got a speaking lesson, it's about developing learners' ability to speak.
Correct.
It's not about, okay, we're going to do a series of exercises, multi-choice exercises on verb tenses. Because skills by orientation require putting language to use in the real world.
Yes.
And so,
and you do talk a lot about taskification. And I remember one of the papers that I read from you, it was in the Task Journal. And it was one idea of yours that really resonates with me, with teachers, is this idea of taskification. Again, not throwing materials out, but working with what's there. And in your experience, Jonathan, when teachers first hear that word, what do you think they misunderstand?
Yeah, they associate tasks with group work. They think I've got to put learners in groups and they've got to talk. And so it's understandable. They think, oh, this is not for me.
Right.
Because I've got 45 students in a crammed classroom with concrete walls, glass, ceiling fans running, lots of noise. And I've got teachers in the classrooms next to me. And I've got a head of department who walks by and wants to see me at the chalkboard. Otherwise, doesn't want to see me standing unemployed at the corner while all the learners are busy working. Paul Nation used to say, a lazy teacher is a good teacher, or something to that effect.
He did.
What did he say in the
that.
podcast? He did.
We
say
interviewed
like
Paul
that.
a few years ago. Yeah, a year ago maybe. He said something along those lines. He also said a brave teacher is one who just sets them to read for 30 minutes in every class, extensive reading. I remember that one.
And H.V. George used to say, who's also a progenitor of, is that the right word? Oh, I threw that word in there. Anyway, he was also influenced Paul's work. He used to say, according to Paul, that the desk is the enemy of learning.
Oh,
interesting.
I like that.
The desk is the enemy of learning. Have you ever tried this when you're teaching? I've had experiences where I've just been teaching a class for a few weeks and it's starting to get pretty dreary. I remember doing this for the first time. I said, look, we started the one, move the desks away. Let's sit in a circle. And something just changed.
Huh.
And then we can continue the lesson in that circle. Another thing I do is
That reminds me of community language learning.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah, which is this idea of, I remember doing a lesson on that. It was just I think it was for my Delta or something, yeah. But going back to taskification, based on your experience from your PhD students' work, where do teachers tend to strip out communicative potential without even realizing it? I think that's something that I'm very in.
And following the textbooks, typically, actually, my students have found that when they just go in the first part of their PhD studies, they'll go in and they'll observe what are teachers doing. Before we intervene in any way or work with the teachers, let's just find out what I call a context, a situation analysis. And they'll find that teachers these are case studies and anecdotal in the sense that I haven't done a massive scale study, but consistently across the studies, they find that if teachers are working with a textbook which has tasks in it, or things that look like tasks or are close to tasks, in these contexts where they don't actually know what TBLT is, they don't understand how interaction can serve the needs of the learners. They're concerned about examinations. They will tend to strip out the interactive dimensions. So an interactive task will be teacher and class. I'm going to ask you these questions, and I'm going to point to you. You say something, and I'm going to correct you.
Right.
So that's the way they strip it out, they see. Because in Dr. Howdow's, she graduated a few years ago, we published something in 2021. She found that the teachers at a university up in the north of Vietnam, were just doing hardly anything interactive and it wasn't that they knew about how good it was, but just didn't want to do it. They just literally didn't understand that had a valid role in the classroom. They thought that the best teaching is the teaching where I am talking to you about the words that you are encountering. I am helping translate this text into Vietnamese and then back to English.
Yeah.
And in doing this, I'm helping you. And then in her study, because she came to me to do her PhD, and I said, look, why are you doing this? Why do you want to do this topic? She says, because the teachers come back to the classroom and they say, oh, the lesson was so boring today. The students are so unmotivated.
Wow.
And again, I don't want to be teacher bashing, but of course the students are unmotivated because they don't have choice and agency. They're just being talked to by the teacher.
Yes. We're going back to Paul Nation here. He said that you got to believe that by not teaching, students can learn. And I feel like that seems to be a mindset that a lot of teachers have a really hard time coming to terms with or even realizing. When we think about taskification, and perhaps I think a lot of us might not know what taskification exactly means. So perhaps you could explain that a little bit for the audience. And while you're explaining that, Jonathan, is taskification mostly about design skills, or is it more about how teachers see activities?
Or about how they implement the activities as well, I think. Yeah, good question. Taskification. So let me just step back and talk you through the steps that we work on to get to taskification. So with my PhD students, we start by taking a textbook and we analyze all the activities in terms of their alignment to the principles of TBLT or the features of tasks. Now, I use the MGOO criteria here, the 4 MGOO. Primary focus on meaning for an objective, right? Some kind of gap that they have to fill. Learners have to use their own resources to fill that gap. So if the teacher pre-teaches all the language, it's automatically not a task because it's just a language practice activity. There may be room for practice activities, but it's just not a task. And then finally, there has to be some kind of legitimate outcome beyond learning language for the sake of learning language. And as I said before, that filling that gap leads inevitably to some kind of valued outcome. Okay, so MGOO, meaning, gap, own resources, outcome. So we analyze all the activities across a series of lessons in a textbook, and we look at alignments. And we might find that there are a few tasks here and there that get 4 ticks, some get 3 ticks. And then we ask the question, which of these activities are adaptable, could be turned into tasks? Now, this is a key thing. Feasibly by teachers who have learned about TBLT.
Right.
And we're not talking about teachers spending 2 hours changing every lesson by creating new handouts and blah, blah, blah. We're talking about tweaking activities to make them more task-like. And I think the MGOO criteria are really useful for that. It's how do we strengthen meaning? How do we create a gap? How do we make sure that learners are using their own resources? Now, learners using their own resources, it may be simply putting the task, moving the task into the first part of the lesson. And I can give you a couple of examples if you want.
Absolutely, yeah.
So in the primary school textbook that I've looked at quite a lot and used in China and Shanghai in particular, there's I'm thinking of a number of activities. One of them is my school bag. And the lesson is about what's in my school bag. This is grade 1. Really, these are just absolute beginners. And it's my pencil is in my school bag. My pencil case is in my school bag. My jacket is in my school bag. My phone is whatever it might be, right? And they put it in and take it out. That's great. I suggested a very simple input-based task because I'm not wanting to get these learners into groups talk about what's in your school because they can't. They're just but an input-based task. Now, and it's the story of Joe and Ding who have come to school and they've both forgotten something in their school bag. So I'm going to tell you what's in their school bag. And here's the list of pictures of the things, we're learning about. And I'm going to tell you what's in their school bags. Can you listen and can you find out or if they forgot something or how many things they forgot? Yeah. Right? So as soon as you do that there's primary focus on meaning. I'm processing this new language because there's a purpose, meaning for a purpose. There's a gap. I'm having to use my own resources to fill that gap. I'm not using them productively. And I think that's one where teachers get hung up on that a bit. They say, how are learners using their own resources when they're just listening? But of course they are, because they're having to do something interpretive. There's intellectual effort involved. And the outcome is they've found out what's missing in the bag. Another one I can think of is this is pictures of 4 people who've got their birthday, 7, 9, 11, 10, whatever it is. Tom is 10 and he's holding his 10th birthday cake, and Mary's holding her 9th birthday cake. And I developed an alternative to that task where the teacher, I said, okay, now 2 of these kids have got their cakes mixed up. They've got the wrong cake. So I'm going to, first of all, I'm going to describe the kids. So you've got to find out who is Tom, who is Mary, who is Sam, whatever. So Tom is wearing a blue shirt and has yellow hair, right? And so they sing it. Okay. Oh, that's Tom and that's Mary. Okay. Now we've found out who they are. I'm going to tell you how old each one is, and you can tell me if anybody, or if you like, if anybody has got the wrong cake. And so you make sure that 2 of them have got the cakes reversed and they listen. Right? Oh. So you can see there.
Very simple input activity tasks. Yeah, that's exactly it.
So you're using the textbook. You're using exactly what's in the textbook, but you're adding something really interesting to it. And surprisingly to me, even in these newly produced textbooks, which are just being produced, these activities don't have information gaps. They don't have simple gaps like this. And as you can see from these examples, it's not hard to create a gap.
No.
And it adds so much value because the students, it's like a game, if you like. All games aren't tasks and all tasks aren't games.
Yeah.
But it gives it a game-like quality for which a 6-year-old is, okay, they're in.
The funny thing is, Jonathan, is that you actually answered one of the audience questions. I had one of our listeners send me a question about, but my students are beginners. They don't know they don't have language to start communicating. And normally what we tell them is start with some input tasks. And I think you just gave us 2 very good examples of how we can work with beginners. We can work with the textbooks. We can create that meaning. We can create that gap. We have that very idea of using their own resources to achieve a very specific outcome.
Yeah. And can I just say something else there about those examples? So it gives the teacher, coming back to my earlier point, it gives the teacher a chance to talk, to use English communicatively and conversationally. So in teachers who it's a way for them to keep their proficiency going in these contexts where they only use English to teach 6-year-olds and then they leave the classroom and that's it. So that's great. Yeah. It also allows them to pick up on Michael Long's 10 methodological principle. I'm not sure if you're familiar with those, but the principles 3 and 4 is rich input and elaborated input. Now, you can, if you think of the Mary, Tom, Jane, or the birthday cakes, the teacher can add any amount of, they can just talk about Tom. Oh, Tom was a naughty boy this morning. He ate his sister's lunch. Or they can actually flesh it out. Now, the wonderful thing is the students don't need to understand that, but they're being exposed to it. And it means that the better students in the class are getting more input. That kind of makes it more interesting for them. And the other students are still able to focus on the key information.
Yes.
But there's all this kind of
incidental learning happening.
Yeah, but it's fun. The teacher can make it really fun and add some cute things about it.
Yeah.
And then ask some questions.
Yeah. No, it's true.
Natsuko Shintani did a fantastic study. Have you talked to Natsuko at some point? On input-based tasks for preschool absolute beginners with zero English. And she did a fantastic study using input-based tasks. And she showed how these kids were acquiring new vocabulary and structural features, plurality, for example, just through doing these input-based tasks where they had to listen to the teacher. Yeah. They had this game where they had these cards with pictures of, say, 2 giraffes or 1 giraffe or 2 batteries and 1 battery. And the teacher would say, put the giraffe in the zoo. And if the student put the picture of the 2 giraffes in the zoo, wrong. You got that one wrong, so you put that in your reject pile. Yeah?
Okay.
Absolute beginners.
Yeah. I wanted to, who was this? Was it Natsuko Shintani?
Natsuko Shintani.
Yeah. We invited her on the podcast, but unfortunately she said she was really busy. Okay. I want to try her again next year. She said this is really busy, but maybe then we'll have her back here.
Yeah.
I wanted to shift gears and talk a little bit about agency because we're in this age of artificial intelligence. So I wanted to talk about the human side for a little moment. And for a lot of teachers, Jonathan, tasks feel risky. A lot of them, it's like there's more noise, there's less control, there's more unpredictability in the classroom. From your experience, what actually makes task-based teaching feel threatening?
All those things. You've answered your own question there. And I would provide some solutions. One is use input-based tasks. 2 is structure. So, the 3 rules of group work, pair work, structures. Provide really manageable structure and steps for the learners to do the task and ground rules. So you've got to really set up the scene. I think you've also got to, learners have to learn how to do group work and task work if we are moving into this kind of unfamiliar waters for teachers. So it's not a matter of, okay, I'm going from teacher-centric, I'm in control, to here you are, you've got 20 minutes, here's a task, do it in groups, chaos. So you have to start small, do little 3-4 minute pair work activities, keep them really short, tightly structured, then get learners to become familiar with the notion of working in groups and gradually expand out from there.
I'm interested in that because I don't know if you've done any studies on this, because I feel I was looking at your publications and you have been very prolific, I would say, in these last maybe 10, 15 years. There's so many publications, I couldn't keep up with all of them. But I'm wondering if in your studies, Jonathan, did you find anything about confidence? If there's anything about the role that confidence plays in implementing task-based language teaching as opposed to knowing the theory?
You mean teacher confidence?
Yeah.
Teacher confidence and teacher competence that we've already talked about.
Yeah, especially with like, because I feel like a lot of teachers, they feel very confident and they say, you know what, I'm just going to try task-based language teaching. There's that element of, you know what, I'm going to take risks, I'm going to do this. Teachers who know the theory and still feel a little resistant to switching. I think the reason I'm asking you this is because do you think that, again, I don't know if this is just a theory that I have, but do you think that task-based language teaching sometimes underestimates how vulnerable teachers feel when they change how they teach?
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So it's a big shift, and teachers can need a lot of support and nurturing to make that transition. And it comes back to starting small. You know, in fact, I was talking to a teacher yesterday with the PPP lessons, and I said, look, if you feel like it's just too much of a jump to move from PPP, just look at strengthening the third part of the lesson. Look at strengthening the taskness of that final thing you do. And then when you feel like you've done that, when you feel like you're learning how to use the MGOO criteria to make it a better activity, this is after you've done the presentation of the structure and the practice of the structure, you're now moving on to the third stage. Make that stronger. If it's in the textbook and it's a bit pseudo, a bit light, but weak, use the MGOO criteria to strengthen it. When you've done that a few times and you're getting confident with that, next step, maybe move that up to the front in a lesson. Try that first.
Right.
So go through those stages.
So start with the production stage and then maybe do the task again when we get to the last P again.
Yeah. I'm curious in the cause-effect relationship with this too, because as we talk about teachers switching how they teach, it implies that they've learned one way and then somewhere mid-career they would switch to something else. And I think there's a myth. We talked to Laura Brafonsky from Georgetown, who argues that, or tries to debunk the myth that TBL is not appropriate for novice teachers. So in terms of training, if this is true, why do you feel that there's a lack of TBL training in early career language teachers?
Oh, yeah. What a great question, man. Have you got any ideas on that? Let me know. What do you guys think?
I have hunches. Yeah. I think language teaching comes across from other disciplines of teaching math, teaching science. And the PPP model comes from that, where in those disciplines, it makes a little bit more sense when language is understood and we're just, here's the knowledge that you need to take away from the class. And we've been teaching language like that for a long time, even though we know it doesn't work. And I'm empathetic to initial training courses, which are only 4 weeks long or 8 weeks long or wherever they are, because you can't teach everything. And that's the example, the teacher example of where we put our students, because in a 4-week training course, how much can someone who comes in knowing very little about how to teach a language actually implement and practice and onboard and use in that 4 weeks? And it's very little. And so I'm empathetic to that. And I don't know, all those courses are quite good. I think the problem is that it stops after 4 weeks or 6 weeks, and the training should continue.
So I find I have quite a few teachers coming through our master's program, and they talk to me about how they have to unlearn some of their CELTA training. I don't want to diss on CELTA at all, but or if you like, broaden beyond it. But I think part of it is also unlearning. Yeah.
Yeah.
Certainly when they engage in my course, they say, oh, because they have to let go of this security blanket of, there's a nice pattern. Here's what we're focusing on today. This is the grammatical structure, and this is what we're going to do to work on it. And it's what we're going to accomplish at the end. And there's room for that. There's room for that in places. And I think that the bigger issue for me is, no, I don't know if it's an issue, but I can spout forth about TBLT and its value, and I certainly have got lots of evidence from the PhD students I've worked with in their research. But context matters. There are so many different contexts and so many different learners with different needs and different aptitudes and different priorities. And we're caught between wanting to make strong principled generalizations while at the same time acknowledging the dynamic complexities of context. And so finding a sweet spot in between those two is important. I think TBLT works with that tension quite well because it's a broad approach. If you take Ellis's approach, which I very much subscribe to rather than Mike Long's, is, the much more flexible approach is draw on the principles of TBLT and use them to the best of your ability within the constraints of your context, which comes back to textbooks, right? We're not going to throw out textbooks. If it was Mike Long, we'd be throwing them out. Tell teachers in a rural school in the Mekong Delta, you're going to create all your lessons from scratch from now on for your 40 students.
It's way too much work.
Obviously, that's not going to happen.
Yeah.
Work with the textbook with an awareness. I think it's this, if you're aware of MGOO, I had a teacher say to me recently after a couple of years after graduating from our program in my TBLT course, he said, every time I walk into the classroom, I just think MGOO. I think MGOO, MGOO. And that's great. It's like a little heuristic that can help teachers, just like a lever or a ratchet. It just allows them to add value to their lessons.
This is actually not something that I was thinking about, but since we've been talking so much about it, and you've mentioned that you subscribe more to the Ellis model of task-based language teaching, I'm wondering if you could comment on, I was exposed to the Willis's model, the Willis's framework, way back in early 2000s. I'm wondering if you could comment, Jonathan, on what you perceive to be the main differences between the Ellis's model and Willis's model, or if there are any similarities or differences in your opinion.
Yeah.
And why you prefer using the Ellis and the MGOO as opposed to Willis's. I think Willis has a 6-question criteria for tasks, whereas Willis has only 4.
Yeah, it gets complicated. Ellis back in 2003 had about 6 or 7 criteria, real world relevance and so forth. So I think he refined it down to 4. And following Paul, from Paul Nation is that Paul Nation tends to whittle away and get to the absolute heart, the core of things. I think simplicity has elegance here. And I think that's the case too with MGOO. I find MGOO incredibly rich. Even just thinking about meaning. What is meaning?
How much you can explore.
There's so much you can explore there in gaps. And so there's a lot to explore there. Coming back to your question, the main difference between the models is that Willis and Willis tend to want to step back from the during task phase when learners are doing a task. They don't want any kind of focus on form in there. They put that into the post-task sort of phase, whereas Ellis would encourage a focus on form right the way through, whatever you're doing before the task, the various steps in doing the task, and then whatever comes after. To be quite honest, I think they're entirely complementary. Ellis's focus on the task as a work plan. So in terms of the thing that you design, this is what MGOO is about. The thing that you design to take into the classroom, does it meet the MGOO criteria? Now, you would put that into the Willis and Willis model, which is pre-task. Then there's a task cycle whereby learners do the task, prepare to report on the task they've done, and then report on the task. And then there's a post-task follow-up where the teacher might identify some issues and spend some time focusing on the language issues that emerge out of that.
Focused and formed there, yeah. Interesting.
Yeah. I think that brings me to another point, which I think teachers can often be confused about, and that is that there tends to be a tendency to associate TBLT with CLT, and of course they're related. But I think that for me, what demarcates task-based language teaching is a principled approach to focus on form in all parts of the task cycle. whereby it's not as if we're saying, look, just let language, either pre-teach the language in a PPP version of CLT, or don't do anything hands off and just let the learners learn through using. In contrast to those approaches, TBLT has a structured, principled approach to getting learners to notice features of language and to fill in the gaps of noticing gaps in their own competence by doing the task, and especially in the post-task phase to have opportunities to fill those gaps, and then hopefully to do a similar task the next day to actually start to put that new learning into action. I think that's a defining feature of TBLT. And coming back to teachers, I think teachers just need to get that into their head that it's not grammar is over in this corner and tasks are over here. Not at all.
I think there was a book, Jonathan. It was probably one of my favorite reads on task-based language teaching. It was a Samuda and Bygate book. I don't know if you're familiar with this one.
Yeah.
I think they talk about tasks as holistic activities. And I think that's like my general perception of tasks is you don't teach pronunciation in isolation, you don't teach grammar in isolation, you don't teach vocabulary. Tasks, in a way, they encompass all of these features as we perform, as we complete those tasks. Yeah. Which makes me wonder, have we spent way too much time arguing about what counts as a task instead of helping teachers design better learning experiences with tasks?
Sure, because the notion of task, it's a fuzzy concept. And Ellis, in his recent writing, has acknowledged that using the MGOO criteria. We talked about meaning. What is meaning? That's fuzzy enough. That's a challenge. Reading a text and then answering 10 comprehension questions, we're focusing on meaning, but it's nothing like a task. And there's a kind of a gap there. Well, it's not really a gap. But sorry, back to your question. Have we focused too much on tasks? I don't think so.
No,
I don't think so. But it depends on whether you're using the MGOO criteria to reject things that aren't tasks and make sure everything fits tightly into a box. If you're doing that, you've got problems. But if you're using MGOO, the notion of a task, as a heuristic, as a, if you like, a framing device or a window into your practice, it's not a rigid orthodoxy. I'll keep coming back to the word, it's a heuristic, which just helps teachers play with their practice a bit more. Yeah. Something I've often said to teachers who are unfamiliar with tasks is, as I said before, one, try it out starting with input-based tasks, move to small tasks, tightly controlled, and gradually expand out. Oh God, I've just forgotten what I was going to say. The next thing I was going to say was, of course, be prepared to fall forwards or fall over. But if you make mistakes, the first time you do it, the learners won't know what you're doing. Yeah. They've got to learn how to do them. They've got to become accustomed. You've got to learn how to manage them. You've got to learn how to manage noise. And one of the things that I find teachers struggle most with is moving students around. Now, get into groups or there's just chaos for 5 minutes and the teacher spends the next 10 minutes trying to get everybody back into order. So this is the structure principle. Make sure you've got a really simple procedure, routine for moving into pairs or groups or whatever it might be. Or I often use the donut. This half of the class, stand right around the wall of the classroom. And ideally, you can put your hands on either side and you can't touch anybody. As soon as you're all around there, facing inwards, everybody else in the class, find a partner and look at them. And immediately you've got pairs set up and then you can go from there. But anyway, falling forwards is really important. The teachers need to be prepared to take risks, make mistakes. And in doing so, it's falling forwards because you're learning. That didn't work. Maybe I need to do that better. In some sense, as a teacher, if you're not falling over, you're not improving, you're not developing.
You're not.
Yeah. My biggest weakness by far, even after all these years, is time management, for sure. I still underestimate how long a task is going to take. I never finish what I think. Like, it's better to have more than less, but I'm like, okay, well, that's tomorrow. That's tomorrow. And if you do see the same student, I know in some places you don't and you share a class with a teacher or whatever, but if you do have the same students consistently, then you can just continue the next class. And I never I'm famous for this. Oh, we're out of time again. We never finish.
I'm the worst. I talked to my master's students just yesterday. It's 10 plus. The class is supposed to have finished 10 minutes ago and you've still got 10 slides left. What?
Yeah, that's very true. Something, Jonathan, that I think you mentioned at the beginning of our conversation, but that kept coming up in your work is how students respond once tasks enter the classroom. And I think one of the messages that I wanted to drill here is perhaps you could tell us more about the importance of that response, specifically in sustaining change. And why am I asking this? Because I feel that specific parts of the world now, specifically North America, I feel like we're very behind when it comes to language education and language teaching. We're still using PPP ad nauseum. We're still teaching with PowerPoints and very little use of tasks in the classroom. So how important is the student's voice, the student's response once tasks are in the classroom?
Yeah, Rod Ellis has this useful notion of micro-evaluation of tasks, which is a really useful way for teachers to get a handle on students' voice. So there are 3 dimensions to micro-evaluation. You evaluate the learner's engagement, so it might be just a simple online check the Likert scale, enjoy, not enjoy, what it
Right.
So so getting a learner's sense of, did you enjoy it? Was it a useful experience? Was it an enjoyable experience or engaging experience or whatever? The second one is performance, looking at the actual performance of the task. Was it successful? Did they do what they were expected to do? And then the third microevaluation, is there any way that we can identify what they learned from the task, or can the learners identify what they feel like they learned?
Yeah.
Including learning about becoming aware of what you need to learn. Right. I realize that I don't know how to do whatever it is. I remember giving my learners in an EAP, in a pre-sessional EAP class, a task where they had to talk about what was going to happen, what they thought was going to happen in the future. And as I went around, nobody in the class, not one, was using will. I think we will have robots doing housework. They would say things like, I think robots do housework, I think. It was interesting. So how did I bring that in there? I'm not sure. The task revealed a gap. And this is Virginia Samuta's idea that maybe partway through the task, and her things in pocket task, I won't go into details, I'm sure you can find
things in pocket.
AI can. Halfway through, she says, right, now I'm going to introduce you to modal verbs and how you can use them to express probability. When you look at the set of objects that have been found, that are in the coat that you've found, and you want to try and find the owner of the coat, and there's a bus ticket, and there's an opera ticket, and there's a whatever else. And you've got to say, I think this is probably a married person with kids. I think this might be or could be or will be.
I think what I find interesting is that happens halfway through the task.
Yeah.
So it's very different from that Willis's model where that only happens after the task is completed.
After the task.
Which makes me wonder, I find that specifically with the classes that I teach, and I have been teaching lately, I find that sometimes I do this post-task and sometimes I do this in the middle of the task. And I don't know if there's evidence to support this, but my hunch is that students seem to pick up the language better, or it's become more salient to them when you do it halfway through the task as opposed to the end of the task. Is there any research, any evidence suggesting otherwise, or?
I think there's good reasoning, because if you set up the task so you're not beginning with the grammar, the learners are oriented towards doing something with language. They're oriented towards towards the objective, to agency, to choice, so they're getting involved, and you've actually given them a chance to notice, I'm not sure how to say this. So if you like, you've generated a need. If you introduce the forms beforehand, I'll just use them. And so if you introduce the forms beforehand, as Willis and Willis have argued for many years, the task turns into a language practice activity, a communicative practice activity. But if they're engaged in trying it at first, if they struggle, they realize, oh man, I'm really having trouble here. I really don't know how to say this. And at that point, you introduce something.
Yeah.
I'm just going to pop that in there and we'll keep going. And my orientation is still towards the task objective.
The completion of the task, but with nudging them a little bit, giving them that would help and achieve that very specific outcome.
Yeah.
You're probably the first researcher that we've interviewed, the first one with the TBLT in Asia. And I remember reading, I think I have one here. We're going to have Chris Van den Brennan coming on the podcast too, and I'm sure you're familiar with his work. And I'm very excited to talk to Chris because he does a lot of work with teachers as well. And I remember him saying that TBLT in Asia seems to be far ahead in comparison to other parts of the world, specifically North America. I'm going to compare it to a context here. But from where you sit right now, what's genuinely different compared to maybe 10, 15 years ago?
First of all, I'd say that the teachers and academics in Asia would probably look across to North America and say, oh, you guys are far ahead of us. So it's all about perspective, isn't it?
I don't think they would if they came here. I don't think it.
Yeah.
Not in a, maybe, I don't know, but in a practical perspective,
Okay.
no.
But if
Like
you
the
look at
research
the
they had here, yeah.
If you look at the Canadian benchmarks, that system which has been around for 20 years, that's very tasky.
It is very tasky in theory. It's very PPP in practice. The execution of it, yeah.
Okay. Back to your question. What was the question?
It was about the TBLT in Asia, because a lot of the success cases that we hear about task-based language teaching come from Asia, come from Vietnam, from China. From where you sit now, what's genuinely different compared to maybe 10, 15 years ago?
Without doubt, it's a shift. It's a curriculum level, top-down policy level shift towards skills-based learning. So without doubt, because there's economic traction through getting a population who are skillful at using English. So at the top-down curriculum level, it's all about communicative skills, being able to use the language. Drawing on the Common European Framework of Reference to a large extent too. So the textbooks, very much, as I gave examples before of textbooks that are now much more oriented towards using the language. So the first thing in a Vietnamese textbook for schools is a dialogue, a conversation. And you have to just listen to it and read it and talk about it.
Right.
So the skills focus is a shift. But I'm talking about top down. Bottom up, I think very little has changed.
Really? And what makes you say that?
Because I deal with, at the moment, I've got a class of 40-something teachers from around Asia and doing my TBLT course. And I talk to them. It's pretty clear that a lot of them are working and struggling with working in a very traditional context where they are required to teach in a certain way. My PhD students, as I said before, they go in and when they're doing an intervention study, they spend the first period of time observing teachers, talking to teachers about what they do. And consistently teachers are, again, it's very hard to paint with a broad brush here because there's a huge diversity of practice. And are we talking about private language schools, primary schools, secondary schools, university programs?
Yeah.
What I found, and this brings us back to textbooks, it's past
Let's keep going back to textbooks, yes.
Yeah. Is that the textbooks that have been introduced are much more communicative. But I often see the teaching hasn't changed as much as it could. That there's still very much a performative approach to teaching.
In the sense that they're still
at the front,
teacher-centered,
controlling things.
Yeah. It hasn't changed here either.
Yeah.
That's one thing I think in the Canadian context that one thing to change would be at a policy level, in my opinion, because I do think Leo has a famous story where he shares sometimes on the show where he taught in this one instance in a task-based way, and then the whole class failed the exams because he didn't teach.
They were being tested on grammar, and all we did was the present perfect. How do we? I'm like, sorry, guys.
We haven't touched on that, and that's the elephant. Speaking of the elephant in the room in Asia is high-stakes assessment.
Yeah.
In the Gaokao exam in China, the key exams, English exams in Vietnam, they haven't shifted much. And so the teachers are under huge pressure to teach to the exam.
Yeah.
So TBLT gets marginalized or just eliminated altogether.
Yeah.
And that's even level, like what's the goal, right? For that case, that's very high stakes. But in a lot of programs, at least speaking here, the goal is for students to be able to use language, live their life. We work with a EAP program, but the students usually are refugees and people coming over, things like this. And they need to settle and reignite their life in a new country, new culture, new language. And they need to get a job. They need to do. So that's the goal. So it's my opinion, but the assessments that we have them do or the schools have them don't align with that goal, and a task-based approach would be much more appropriate for that end goal of that avatar learner. But if the
task-based assessment, would you assess them on the task? Can you do the task?
Can you
go to the bank and actually open an account? It's a tough thing for a teacher to change everything, because in Leo's example is extreme where they all fail the test at the end. But there is a policy, like it's a combination, right? Where policy should change as well, because we know that this works And the way that it's a big ask for a big institution that makes a lot of money to change everything that they're doing, of course. That's, I think, when Leo says Canada's behind, that's what we're talking about, because it is.
Yeah. Yeah. I want to end this because our conversation, we could go for another hour here very easily, but I wanted to thank you, Jonathan, for sharing all of this with us. I've been meaning to talk to you for a long time, but I wanted to end this on a very practical note. And I wanted to ask you this: if a teacher listening right now is very curious about task-based language teaching, but also feeling very overwhelmed by its constraints, what's one small shift they could make, perhaps this week, even tomorrow, as they walk into a classroom?
Drawing on ideas from task-based language teaching. At a cognitive level, at an awareness level, I would say think about MGOO. Just look at what you're doing and maybe don't change anything, but just ask yourself the question: what, are any of these qualities or features present in the activities I use? So I think an awareness raising step, just getting used to thinking from that angle before you jump into trying to do fancy group work. And then I would move to, next step would be looking at reading or listening or input-based tasks and activities and seeing if you can taskify some of those, perhaps before moving into group work. And that might be something like, I'll just give you one more example. So I was talking to a teacher yesterday who has this reading activity lesson where there are 3 case studies of 3 people who've turned their hobbies into revenue-generating streams, revenue-generating activities. And the pre-reading activity is brainstorm ways you can turn a hobby into making money. It's trivial, and then they go on to read these 3 and answer a bunch of comprehension questions. And we were exploring how would you taskify this, and it seems to me that there needed to be some way that the predictions that you make create the gap that you then try to fill by reading. So you make predictions, you compare predictions, and then you read to check if any of your predictions are present in the reading. End up reading for a purpose.
Right.
Right?
So it's a task where they have to basically come up with ways to monetize hobbies. And then once they have come up with ideas, they would have to read to see if those ideas actually match some of the ideas.
Was I?
Yeah, that's actually...
There's a great Paul Lemming and Justin Harris did a great book on task, which was only published in Japan, unfortunately. But I'll give you one final example from their book. So they had a reading passage on research on how long it takes people to purchase different things: toilet paper, toothpaste, cars, houses, cheese, milk, whatever it is, right? Because believe it or not, people research this kind of thing. So you can see here, right? It's ripe for a task-based reading thing where, first of all, you've got the list of these products and the learners have to rank them, which is the fastest, which takes the least time to buy, which takes the longest. I've got to rank them. And they're going to compare their ranking with somebody else. So you can do it interactively if you want to stretch it out a bit and just report and talk about it and justify. So you can turn that priming activity into a task in its own right. Then they read, and then they have to fill in put in a ranking from the passage and compare it to their own ranking. Yeah. Now, to me, that's task-based reading. Because you've got a gap, you're reading for a purpose, and so often the brainstorming to begin with is unrelated to the reading. It's just supposed to warm them up. Now read.
No.
Why am I reading? I don't know. Just read.
Yeah, no, I like that.
Learn.
I like that. Yeah,
read and underline the words you don't know, which is another classic thing.
You actually reminded me of a reading text that I used a long time ago. It was about a woman who tried to kill her husband 7 different ways. And I remember telling my students, I'm like, okay, this is the situation. I want to see if you can come up with...
I don't like where this is going, Leo.
But it's similar in a way. It's we're just removing this idea of, here's some lexes. We're going to be talking about the previewing part of a reading lesson.
The pre-task. If you were going to kill your spouse, how would you do it?
Yeah, 7 ways. This woman just decided to kill her husband. She tried 7 different things. What were they? And then they would read to try to. They have again. It goes back to what you said. They have purpose. There's a very clear reason for them to actually read that text. as opposed to, you just said, they're not invested. There's no investment in the reading when you do something like that.
Here we go. Investment, choice,
Yeah.
motivation. Again, all of those things get bundled in together as soon as you do that. And this is the thing. Teachers can do this really easily, or not easily. If you've got a reading lesson coming up and you've got a passage, what can you do beforehand which gives reading a purpose?
Yeah.
And therefore makes it an input-based task. Providing that, in that example, and this is, Rod Ellis is quite strong on this, that input-based tasks require minimal output. So if your pre-reading activity is discuss and talk about and generate, it becomes an output-based kind of task. It's not. But if it's just rank these things 1 to 10.
Yeah.
Anyway.
And just the last question would be, what's one thing that teacher educators may need to stop doing in order to promote more task-based language teaching in pre-service and in-service training?
Yeah, you've touched my sensitive spot here. We should be actually practicing what we preach in tasks to teach about language teaching.
Yes. Yeah.
So I think we all have to be doing that more.
Yeah.
And that doesn't mean to say, here's a question, discuss it in groups. It means, now, look, teacher education is not the same as learning a language, so it's not going to fit precisely. But getting learners to do objective-driven activities whereby there's some kind of gap and they've got to work their way through that gap, they've got to draw on the readings.
I like that.
Something I do, for example, I say, okay, everybody, the reading for this week is, I don't know, Shintani 2016, key reading. Everybody's got to come up with a one-page diagrammatic representation of that article. You're not allowed to use more than one page. You've got to use visuals, and we're going to come back and you're going to talk, someone else in groups, work on your visual, show them to each other, and vote for the best one, and then present the best one to the class. Yeah. Well, I think that fits into a task, and it works well in an academic environment.
Nice. It really does. It really does.
Jonathan, as we end here, can you tell everyone where people can find your work and what you're working on now? I guess if they just type in my name into whatever their search engine is, Jonathan Newton and Victoria University of Wellington, or VUW, you'll come up with my website, and there's a list of my publications there. I'm working on a bunch of different projects at the moment. Goodness, where do I start? I've got a lot of PhD students working on textbooks in rural context, and I've got 7 that I'm the primary supervisor for, so I've got a fair bit of sort of my work invested in those projects. I'm looking at the moment at AI-generated task-based lessons. And so using Willis and Willis have got something they call the task generator, which is, I don't know if you recall that, it's a set of 7 task types, matching, ranking. Put that into AI and you say, okay, here's a topic that we're going to deal with this week. Come up with task activities for each of these task types. It's fantastic. I found that Gemini does it better than ChatGPT, but who knows? It's a shifting
I've
scene.
been trying Perplexity, and I've been getting some pretty good results with tasks as well there.
Yeah.
But you're right. Gemini and Perplexity, I feel like they definitely generate better tasks as compared to ChatGPT.
Yeah.
And yeah, sorry, you're going to add something there.
I was going to just add a plug. So Jane Willis is one, and it's going to be back to front again, but visually. Oops, that's my name.
There you go.
A framework for task-based learning. Just to let everybody know that Justin Harris and Paul Lemming have re-edited. This is from 1996.
Yes.
It needed
There's
the
a new
update
version coming up, right?
coming out. And if you haven't talked to those guys, get them on your podcast.
You know, it's funny. I was talking to Jane Willis to come back on the show because she was here, I think, in the first or the second year of the podcast, Jonathan.
Yeah.
And she mentioned Paul and Justin, and we would do a podcast with the 4 of us, the 5 of us actually.
Oh my God. That'd be fun.
The problem is just that we're all in different time zones. She's in the UK, Japan, we're in Canada. But we're definitely probably going to get the 2 of them to come on the podcast because you mentioned their book on task as well. We definitely want to have them on the show.
Yeah. To really plug this, the new edition of that is great. And they've been working with Jane on that. It's coming out this year. So that's pretty exciting.
Yeah.
All right. We'll put a link in the show notes of the show.
Yeah, I can send you a link if you want. If you can't find, I can send you a link to the publishing page. I think it's Multilingual Matters.
Because I think this was my version is from Longman. It's a Longman.
No, it is indeed Longman, this one, but I think it's Multilingual Matters.
Multilingual
and another plug that Rod Ellis is putting out his final TBLT book this year, Issues in Task-Based Language Teaching.
His final book? Is he
And I have-
retiring after that? Is
I
that the
believe
plan?
so. This is his final TBLT book, and I've read it, pre-publication version, and it's fabulous.
Maybe we
Really
should get
readable.
maybe we should get Rod Ellis on the podcast to talk about that book with us.
Oh, you bet.
We'll name drop you for sure, Jonathan.
Okay.
New Zealand has a really nice TBL community, it seems.
Yeah. Martin East, of course, up in Auckland as well, and Rosemary Earlham. Yeah,
Yeah,
bunch of
Martin East,
great
that's
people
right.
here.
Yeah. Thank you very much for this, Jonathan. We appreciate it. And we hope to have you on the show soon.
Okay. Thanks, guys.